guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today I'm here with the first part of my March reading wrap-up, and my March reading got off to a really phenomenal start this month, so I thought that I would split up my wrap-up into two parts, starting with today's books, which were kind of a mixed bag, ranging from liked it to oh my god, I want to throw myself out a window. I hated this book so much. So let's get started. The first book I want to talk about is Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, which is a much loved book here on BookTube, and it was also the first book that I've knocked off my Back from the DNF TBR. And I read it as a buddy read with Katie from Books and Things, which was a really fantastic experience. And in case you don't know much about the plot of Rebecca, it follows a young, unnamed narrator of rather modest background who marries a wealthy English widower named Maxim de Winter. And Maxim is almost twice her age and is the master of a beautiful estate called Manderley. And his first wife was a woman named Rebecca, and the shadow of Rebecca looms incredibly large for the narrator, who is quite naive and inexperienced and is really out of her depth as a new wife and as the new mistress of Manderley. And so she spends much of the book being incredibly envious of Rebecca and feeling like she can never quite live up to the larger-than-life woman that she imagines Rebecca was. And Daphne du Maurier was a big fan of the Brontes, and there are a lot of references and parallels between Rebecca and Jane Eyre in particular. And when Katie and I were discussing this book, we talked a lot about how Rebecca can be read as a sort of modern retelling of Jane Eyre or as a modern response to Jane Eyre. Not only do both books have a large age and class difference between the female protagonist and the male love interest, but you also have kind of the sinister presence of Maxim and Rochester's first wives. You have a big estate in Thornfield Hall and in Manderley, and you also have plenty of plot twists and turns in both of the books. But it's where Rebecca kind of diverges from Jane Eyre that things get really interesting. And Katie and I talked a lot about how the relationship between the narrator and Maxim in Rebecca can be read as a sort of sinister take on the relationship between Jane and Rochester. And Rebecca in general, I think, can be read as sort of how Jane Eyre would have gone if Jane wasn't such a strong character. The narrator in Rebecca doesn't know herself in the way that Jane knows herself, and she doesn't have a sense of identity or a sense of her own values. And in that way, I think Rebecca has some really interesting things to say about female identity and the ways in which men control and contain female identity, and also how women are often forced to form a sense of identity through external societal expectations, whether it be through the male gaze or through comparing themselves to other women. And while I really loved reading this book within the context of Jane Eyre, I don't know how much I would have liked this book as just a standalone read. It's definitely extremely well written, and it has a kind of pulpy feel that makes it very engaging and at times thrilling. I don't know that it really left much of an impression on an emotional level, which is something I really prioritize when I read. But I definitely recommend it for the entertainment value, and I really recommend it if you're interested in reading it and doing some comparative analysis between this book and Jane Eyre. But speaking of female identity and the ways in which men try to control and contain women, next up I have Troublesome Love by Elena Ferrante. And as some of you may know, I'm a huge fan of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan novels, as you can see, and I've slowly been making my way through all of her other titles. So this was actually my last Elena Ferrante book, and it just happens to be the first book that she ever published. And this book follows a middle-aged woman named Delia who gets a series of disturbing and obscene phone calls from her mother shortly before her mother turns up drowned in Naples. And so Delia returns to Naples, which is the city of her birth, to kind of retrace her mother's final days, and in doing so retraces much of her mother's life and her complicated relationships with Delia's abusive father and with a mysterious man named Caserta. And while this book is quite slim, it is psychologically dense and disorienting, and it touches on a lot of the themes that Elena Ferrante explores in her other books. And I would say that this is Elena Ferrante's messiest book. The writing and the translation feel kind of sloppy at times, and the sentences tend to pile up on themselves, but it's also her most raw and visceral book. There is violence in all of her books, but in this one it really hits you like a slap in the face. And in all of her books, the female protagonists have a complicated relationship with the city of Naples, but in this book the city feels absolutely stifling, and you can feel the heat and the lack of air and the aggressive dialect in a way that makes it feel like the streets are collapsing in on you. And in all of her books, Elena Ferrante deals with women who are losing a grip on themselves and their sense of reality. And she explores what happens when there's that slippage and when the margins of reality and memory and self start to blur. But in this book, that sense of slippage and disorientation is especially acute. And because it's so disorienting, I sometimes was reading it kind of with the aim of getting to the end of the book so I could understand what it was all about. So I can't say that this book was a fun read. Elena Ferrante really knows how to make you feel uncomfortable. But a lot of this book is about the ways that men control women and the ways that internalized misogyny can manifest in other women. So I think it's really worth the read as a feminist text. And on a different note, there's also some interesting psychological stuff going on in this book, especially as it regards mother-daughter complexes and sort of repetition compulsions. So I definitely recommend this book if you're looking for some feminist reading, and also if you're already a fan of Elena Ferrante, but I wouldn't recommend starting here if you haven't read her before, just because it is a very disorienting and kind of unpleasant read. And last, but definitely least, we have Nellie Dean, A Return to Wuthering Heights by Alison Case. What a mess, you guys. This book was truly awful. It like boggles the mind. And I feel bad saying that because I know that Katie over at Books and Things read this book and really enjoyed it. So I'm going to link her wrap up where she talked about that book in case you want a more positive take. So this book is basically Wuthering Heights retold from the perspective of housekeeper Nellie Dean, who is the original narrator of Wuthering Heights. So kind of a flawed premise. This is basically Wuthering Heights fan fiction where Nellie Dean and Hindley Earnshaw were in love, and it kind of retells Nellie's life story with a focus on that quote-unquote romance. And listen, I have no problem with fan fiction, but I do have an issue with like boring and dull fan fiction, which is what this was. My first big problem with this book is that the relationship and romance between Hindley and Nellie isn't developed in any way. It's basically like, we grew up together, therefore we're in love, but like Hindley is barely a character and is written in a really inconsistent way, and then the book spends more time talking about the prolonged deaths of the elder members of the family than it does in developing the bond and relationship between Hindley and Nellie. So right from the get-go, I didn't give two hoots about the most important relationship in the book. And even worse than that, this book is just so boring. It was so dull. And Wuthering Heights is known for its melodrama and for its emotionally hyperbolic quality. And in contrast, this book had whole chapters about rent collection, and all of the characters in the book are kind of pale shades of the original characters in Wuthering Heights, except for Nellie, who is a completely different character entirely, where in Wuthering Heights she's kind of this gossipy, manipulative housekeeper. In this book she's kind of your standard strong female protagonist who you're supposed to identify with because she loves reading. Okay. Anyway, I found most of this book super dull except for these bizarre moments where there would be a witchcraft subplot that came out of nowhere, and I think I just kept reading because I was is this book going anywhere? What is the point? And it really delivered in the end, because in the most contrived way, a letter shows up that kind of explains everything in a truly bonkers way, and I don't want to give anything away, but it's insane. It was so bad that I almost kind of loved it, but it was a train wreck. So yeah, I didn't like this book. I thought it was awful. I do not recommend. If you're interested in a Wuthering Heights retelling that focuses on the Nellie character in a more interesting and successful and compelling way, then I recommend that you check out A True Novel by Minae Mizumura, because that's an excellent book. If you have recommendations for other Bronte retellings that you think might be more successful than this one, definitely let me know know in the comments below. Also, let me know what you think of all 3 of these books, and I'll be back at you tomorrow with the best books I read in March. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Bye!